Okay, so limited partnerships. As the book says, this form of business organization is becoming less and less frequently used. And the reason is that at common law, at least, it had some onerous restrictions. So what it required was that you had to have a type of partner called a general partner, who was in charge of managing the enterprise. And then you could have a series of other partners who were called limited partners. Now, the benefit of being a limited partner was that you had limited liability. But the problem with being a GP was while you were entitled to participate in the management of the partnership, you had joined several liability for the liabilities of the partnership, right? So you had to choose. Are you going to be involved but be exposed, or are you going to be not involved and therefore get limited liability? And that was annoying to people that restriction existed, especially when LLCs came along, because LLCs have very much the same attributes of a limited partnership. For example, they have pass-through taxation, but they don't have the same restrictions. You can have members of an LLC who have limited liability, but who can all participate in the management of the LLC. And so as soon as that became available as an option, why mess around with limited partnerships, right? I will tell you, though, that lawyers were smart, and they realized, hey, if that's the problem, I have an answer. I'll just set up my general partner as a LLC or an Inc. All right, and what does that let me do? Well, it adds a liability blocker, if you will, because now I can have an owner of this entity who actually does the decision making and runs the business. But because that person is a shareholder of an entity that has limited liability, the liabilities of the limited partnership stop at this level and don't go all the way up, right? And so in the end, that picture resembles the outcome here by just simply being creative with the structure. But it's messy and complicated, and why not just do this, right? And so for that reason, we don't see these very much, except we do see them in the so-called alternative asset management business. And that means in venture capital or private equity or hedge funds, right? They tend to be organized as limited partnerships, although we have started to see quite a few of them show up as limited LLCs. The predominant form for this industry is LP. That's probably driven mostly by tradition. People who invest in these kinds of funds are used to seeing limited partnership agreements, and they don't want to learn a new kind of agreement. It just takes time, and why bother? And so let's just stick with what we've been used to is pretty much the explanation. And so if that's the space you're going to be in, and it's a very big and obviously very important space that lawyers are involved in, you do still have to understand what limited partnerships are and how limited partnership agreements are set up. And so with that, we're going to take a quick tour through the limited partnership agreement we were given in the textbook. It's a limited partnership agreement for a venture capital fund, right? One of these. Called the Wildcat Capital Partners Fund 4 LP. And with that example, we'll go through a little discussion of how the alternative asset business works and how the business deal in those funds gets translated into a limited partnership agreement. Okay, so let's just talk about the basic deal that is behind an agreement like this one. Right, the Wildcat Capital Partners deal. Okay. Well, we have a limited partnership, right? And in this case, we have a GP that's called Wildcat Capital Management LLC, right? LLC, and that's the GP, right? And we have a bunch of LPs, right, who are identified for us on the back, right? So this is the schedule of limited partners, right? And we have a list here of all the money they're putting into our limited partnership, right? And so the deal is our LPs are putting money into the fund, and in exchange for that, what are they getting, right? So they're investing money, and Wildcat Capital Management is saying to those LPs that it can find profitable investment opportunities in the venture capital space, right? So it's going to do VC investments, right? That's investing in usually startup companies or early stage companies, right? And so what's going to happen is with this Wildcat Management's expertise, its deal flow, its access to transactions, it's going to go around and take the pile of money that was invested by the limited partners and put it into these VC deals. And then hopefully down the road, those VC deals are going to return to the fund 10 times or more of the money that was invested, right? That's the idea. That's the model. Now, why is that deal being made in this limited partnership? Well, presumably Wildcat Capital Management has some kind of track record, some kind of way of establishing to the limited partners that it's likely and better than they are in finding ways to invest capital in good transactions that have this kind of profit potential, right? And so, in a sense, this is a way of hiring Wildcat for their investment talent, right? So these folks are putting in money, that's their contribution. These folks are contributing talent, right? And we see that in the agreement quite obviously, right? Because it's very clear capital contribution here, right? Article 4 says no capital contributions shall be required of the general partner. So even though they're the general partner, and as we'll see later, they're entitled to certain economics, they are going to get some of the money that gets earned, they don't have to put any money in, right? It's interesting. Whereas each limited partner shall contribute to the partnership the amount set forth on Schedule A, right? And we saw that a second ago. But look, these folks are putting in a total of $135 million collectively, right? The general partner is putting in nothing, right? And so obviously there has to be something else that Wildcat is doing in order to get its role as the general partner. And the answer is it is presumably has convinced the LPs that it can find good deals, right? And that's what it's offering. Okay. So what else is going on in this agreement? Well, presumably there is an assumption about what the reward will be if those deals turn out to be successful, right? And so we can see later on a provision that talks about, let's see, allocation of profits and losses. Okay, so our credit and charge, as the case may be, of the partners as to the partners as follows: 80% shall be allocated to the limited partners and divided among them in proportion to their capital contributions. So based on how much they put in, how much the 135 million each of them put in, and 20% should be allocated to the general partner. Okay, well, what does that mean? That means that, let's say this partnership invests 100 in company Y, and then 5 years later it sells company Y for 500, i.e. creating a 400 profit. 20% of that 400 profit, or 80, is going to belong to the manager, even though the manager didn't put any money in the deal, right? Remember, they made no capital contribution to the limited partnership. And the other 320, the 80%, is going to go get paid out to the limited partnership, limited partners in consideration of their investment, right? So they're putting in all the money, but only 80% of the profits are coming back to them. 20% go back to Wildcat. Well, so why is that? And again, the answer is you got to pay for talent, right? And so presumably these folks are so excited about these folks' ability to make money with their money, they're willing to cut them in to the tune of a 20% on what we call a carried interest, meaning it's carried by them because they put in all the money, even though they get part of the interest, right? So that's the very common structure in a hedge fund, private equity fund, a venture capital fund. But is that the end of the story? Right? What else is going on? Well, we're going to see here in a second. There are not only are they getting paid that carried interest, they're also getting paid fees for their services, right? So one, it says that they get reimbursed for everything it took to start the partnership up. So the legal fees of setting up this agreement, they get reimbursed for to the extent they paid it out of their own pockets. But more importantly, it says they get paid by the partnership in advance on the first day of each month, a management fee equal to 1/6 of 1% of the then net value, right? Can you do the math? That basically means they get a 2% per annum fee on the total value of whatever's inside this partnership. So initially it'll be $135 million, and thereafter, based on how much the things they invest in are worth at any given time, you take that and add it all up, and 2% of it is going to get paid to these guys, right? 1/6, yeah. So that is on top of the carried interest. Now, why is that? Why are they getting a management fee? And notice that management fee is not dependent on there being profits. In fact, it's based on how much the assets under management are here. So even if LP never made a dime in profits from their investments, they'd still be paying out this 2% per annum management fee to Wildcat. And the answer is, again, in order to induce the people who make up Wildcat to go to work finding profitable investments for them, the LPs have to fund the cost of doing that. And the purpose of this 2% per annum management fee, as we see, is to allow the general partner to pay the expenses of operating itself and of doing the deals, right? So here we see the costs of normal legal and accounting fees associated with the acquisition of investments in portfolio companies is is meant to be paid by the general partner out of the proceeds of having received these periodic management fees. Okay. How long is all this meant to last? Well, how long are we going to give our manager to go find $135 million worth of deals, to manage those deals so that the companies reach a stage where they are successful, and then turn around and sell them, right? So that there's realized proceeds that can then be distributed 80-20, right? And the answer is the general rule is 10 years. That's industry standard so this agreement was created in 2011. And notice we can find in section 3 a term, right? And it says the partnership shall continue up to the 2020, right? Which is roughly 10 years later, a little shorter, right? Plus the addition of 3 one-year extensions. Now, why might a general partner elect to extend the partnership longer? Well, it's probably because sometimes it takes longer than you think in order to sell all of your investments. They've accumulated this portfolio of venture capital companies, and some of them are still hanging around, and so that gives them a little leeway to get them all sold. Okay. What other things are worth sussing out? Well, if you think about it, if you are a bunch of well-to-do institutions, individuals, families, and you are placing a large amount of money, $135 million, at the discretionary disposal of a group of investment managers, okay, and you're giving them 10 years, plus 3 extra years if they need it, to put that money to work and make profits, presumably, right? And if they do, and as they are doing that, you're willing to pay them 2% of the amount of money that's in the pot every year as a way of dealing with their costs, including probably salaries and benefits and so on, right? So they're going to be making a couple $1 million a year at least just by having the money in the kitty, right? And then on top of that, you're going to give them a 20% carried interest, so profits interest in whatever profits are realized by this venture, right? What are you going to want? What are you going to expect to see in your deal, in your limited partnership agreement? Well, so for example, how would you feel about it if Wildcat Management, the team that was investing the money that you had entered into this 10-year deal with, came to you one day and said, hey, we're selling out. We've decided that we don't want to do this anymore and that we're going to sell our 20% interest, our GP position, to someone else who's then going to take over and invest the money for you, right? Now, you would imagine that the LPs would want to say in that because obviously they were very interested in who it was they engaged in the first instance. And so they would be equally interested in making sure that the person who would take over, if that were ever to happen, is someone acceptable to them. And so, as you would imagine, the limited partnership agreement will say, find it if we can, transfers. All right, look. Transfers of the general partner's interest. The general partner shall not transfer, sell, encumber, mortgage, assign, or otherwise dispose of any portion of its interest. Right? So not only can it not sell its voting position, obviously it can't even sell some stake in its interest in the partnership because that would water down the incentives that are in this arrangement between the LPs and the Wildcat management team. The LPs want the Wildcat management team in the seat for the period that the partnership is up and running. And that's what this says. Okay. What else would you look for? Well, do you think the folks at Wildcat Management should be able to have Wildcat Fund 5 or 6 or 7 or other activities that distract them from the focus they're supposed to have on investing the $135 million that these guys have given them to manage? And the answer, again, of course, is you would expect that not to be permitted. So let's see. Here. Right. This provision says, while they may have some existing venture capital partnerships, and presumably they do because that's the basis on which you decided that they were good at it, right? The deals they've been doing so far. But from now on, can they set up something similar, another fund that's going to have similar activities to Fund 4? And the answer is no, unless the majority of limited partners agree or 75% of the money, the $135 million, has been put to work, right? And so that's the idea, is that until Wildcat Management has done most of the work of deploying the money in the fund, in the venture capital investments, they have to focus on this fund, can't start another one. And again, that's not a surprising provision given the nature of the deal they have. And so that's why we see this provision in the limited partnership agreement. What else? How about letting other people invest? Okay. So suppose there's someone out here, a stranger, if you will, to the partnership. Should Wildcat allow them to participate in one of the deals that the LP is doing? Now, there could be very good reasons for allowing that to happen. Obviously, it's probably not a bad idea to let the management team, for example, of the particular startup invest. Or maybe there's another co-investor, another fund that has a particular expertise in the deal, in the space that the deal is in. Or maybe that other fund brought the opportunity to Fund 4, right? And therefore is being compensated for that by letting them co-invest in the deal. There are all kinds of reasons why it would be a good idea. But what does this provision say, right? It says that this general partner may not participate in that side investment, right? In other words, they can't make any money from the fact that somebody else invested in the deal. They have to make their money through the limited partnership, through their carried interest, right? And why is that so important? Well, because you want to make sure that when they make the decision about whether or not to let the stranger invest, they are making that decision from the point of view of someone who has all their eggs in this basket. In other words, from the point of view of the shared incentives they have with the limited partner, right? Wildcat lets stranger in the deal because stranger is going to make the deal better for the benefit of the limited partners of Fund 4 and themselves via their carry, not via some side deal. Right? Again, a provision that makes sense when you understand the economics of venture capital investing. A final provision that might need a little explaining is if you look at this document, it's pretty favorable to the general partner. Most of the provisions are telling you it's all up to the GP, and the LP has to rely on the GP to do a good job. But there's one place where it is specifically made clear that if the GP and the LPs disagree, then some third party has to come in and decide what the right answer is. Okay, and that's when it comes to the valuation of the investments. Right? Now, why would we think that would be the one place where some third party, the idea of a arbiter or an outside decision maker, is contemplated by our partnership agreement? Why would we think that we can't rely on either the GP to make the right choice or to give the GP the discretion to make the choice rather than inserting this idea of having there be some kind of dispute resolution process? And the answer is, well, what's value mean? Why is it important? When is it an issue that's going to come up? And well, when we remember how the management fee is calculated, right? Remember the 2% per annum. What is it calculated on? Right? 1/6 of 1% or 2% a year of the then net value. Okay. So value is what drives how much the GP gets paid every year, right? And so you could see why it's quite normal for an agreement not to give someone who's getting paid the ability to decide how much that pay is every year for themselves, without there being some mechanism for there to be a third party who can revisit that determination, right? Because there's a natural conflict of interest, right? If I get to decide how much I'm going to get paid every year, I might be a little bit more generous than might be justified. And so we put in place a mechanism, quite naturally, to counter that human nature. Okay, so again, those are the kinds of things that we would expect to see in our limited partnership agreement for a venture fund. They are explained by the story, the narrative behind what's going on, right? So this is a very standard form of document, but it has features in it that are driven by the nature of the deal. And so what's interesting is to understand the narrative, the backstory, the business terms that underlie what otherwise looks like a pretty legalistic document.